after including DBT, mindfulness, ACT methods, when does it not become CBT anymore? How do you handle disparate techniques that may contradict each other?
I think, do you want to answer that first?
Go ahead, if you can answer.
I think CBT is the integrative psychotherapy. In fact, you wrote a book with Brad Alford a number of years ago called The Power of Cognitive Therapy, or Integrative Cognitive Therapy. That's it, Integrative Power of Cognitive Therapy. What I think is so important about CBT is that we can choose techniques from almost any psychotherapy in the context of the cognitive model. So people who are pretty strict ACT therapists, I know many of them do use cognitive techniques, but if you're really a strict ACT therapist, you're very limited in the number of techniques you can use. I think one of the most wonderful things about cognitive therapy is that we're never limited as long as it fits into the cognitive model and as long as there's empirical support for using those techniques.
Yeah, well, building on what Judy just said, you have to think in terms of what makes a person better. To me, it seems inevitable that it's learning or unlearning, as the case may be, that makes a patient better. So when a person gets better, there is something in the learning or unlearning that is actually crucial to the getting better. And so there are a variety of methods. Now, it was mentioned earlier that one of the methods that ACT uses is
Mindfulness?
well, not just mindfulness, but it has to do with compassion. Well, compassion for the self, compassion for others is also integral to cognitive therapy, so that many of the methods that are already used by some of the other approaches actually are intrinsic. And those that are not intrinsic, if they produce learning or unlearning, then they should be incorporated into the cognitive model.
Any other thoughts?
Acceptance and compassion involve attitude. Attitudes involve belief, cognition. So how could they not be cognitive?
That's right. Acceptance means learning that you can tolerate something.
And I just want to add, CBT being an umbrella term, and I've been working with Steve Hayes lately, he would consider ACT now as part of CBT. We won.
He said we won.
Yeah, can I ask a question about that? Are you happy about that? Are you happy that he considers ACT a part of CBT? Is that
Well,
a
ACT
good
does not have a CBT. It does not have a cognitive theory behind it. And the cognitive theory is very important for wanting to know what do you use when, what method do you use at what time, with what type of patient, and what particular culture. So it's the cognitive model which is the roadmap for it, and ACT, as it is practiced now, though it does get good results, does not have this kind of roadmap that cognitive therapy has.
So if I could just add, so I think Steve has a different definition of cognition, but he's not saying that cognitive processes don't exist. He has a different way of framing cognitions. And so on a fundamental level, we disagree. On a fundamental philosophical level, we disagree. Yet he does consider it, so the most important aspect is the empirical support, and that fits still within the CBT framework. And I was okay with him saying ACT is part of CBT. He has a slight, and again, I think this is also the issue of what are cognitions. I mean, you, Dr. Beck, you wrote a lot on this issue. I mean, it depends on level of processing, depends on cognitions, our beliefs, our automatic thoughts, can be even in information processing biases are cognitions. It depends on how we measure it, how we quantify it, how we study it. But I don't think this is a problem. It's in a way it's sort of similar to the concept of the gene, as we understand more. Initially, the gene was defined as this thing that was in a plant that transmitted colors from one bean to the next, and Mendel didn't know exactly what it is, but it was defined as this thing that was in these plants, and now the definition of gene is actually quite complex. It's now a sequence on the DNA that codes for particular protein, but it doesn't necessarily need to have a phenotype. So it's getting quite complex what the exact definition of a gene is. So it's a coding DNA versus a non-coding DNA, and so but I think this is the issue with cognitions. Cognitions are very can be defined on different levels of complexity, and I don't think this is a disadvantage. It's actually an advantage because it suggests how advanced our science has become, because we're now talking on very complicated terms on different levels.
There's a question back here.
If I could just follow up with that. So what would be Steve's definition of a thought or a cognition?
Oh, ask Steve, please.
Prior learning, right?
I mean, he has a very clear theory, which is different than information processing approach. He talk about relation frame theory, which is very behavioral. I mean, we should acknowledge that. So the integration can be done maybe more at the level of the psychotherapy processes and some techniques, rather than at the level of the cognitive theory. Even if we define cognition very large, like information processing, be it conscious, meaning explicit, or unconscious, meaning implicit. However, he wouldn't recognize that. I mean, he wouldn't go with that.
And now that you mentioned the Academy of Cognitive Therapy, I think we have to put a plug in there, because when we talk about the future, you know, here's a place where we do have inclusivity and not exclusivity. But the key is that the Academy represents therapeutic interventions, evidence-based, under the cognitive model, which allows for a broad array of, doesn't matter what the intervention is, doesn't matter what you call it. If we're operating under this model, it fits. If you're going to do eye movement work, even though you have inert processes, still what's the mediator of change? Cognitive change. So fine, we'll include you. It's a big inclusive model that allows all of us that sit under this umbrella to be unified to deliver this. And not only that, look at what's been said on the panel. Let's bring this across disciplinary processes. So we have psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers, and let's bring it to the paraprofessional, as Judy suggested. Let's bring it into the trenches and share these model of operating, understanding people, understanding their problems, and apply the skills that we can teach people so that the world can be less distressed and more functional. And so that's why everyone in this room, if you ask me, needs to support the Academy of Cognitive Therapy.
Were there any other comments or reactions to anything that has been said before we move on?
Maybe I would add something, because, you know, we just published a meta-analysis
It's on. Yeah.
in which practically we found what Dr. Beck said, that both cognitive behavior therapy and the other therapies, including different approaches, psychodynamics, experiential, humanistic, and so on, they both affected in the same way the cognitive component. And from my perspective as a cognitive behavior therapist, I said, look, this is a proof that the other therapies would work by changing cognitions. However, my colleagues, my co-authors, because I was not the primary author, said no. It just proves practically that we change symptoms by different mechanisms, and the change in cognition is practically associated to the change in symptoms, is part of the changing symptoms. That is why we need more research, clinical and fundamental, to show that indeed the theory of change and the mechanism of change, as we formulate them, are there and strong. And in the end, we put both interpretation, saying that the results could be seen in different ways, and we put both of them. But at the beginning, of course, I just went following the CBT idea, and I still believe in that, but I feel that we need more data for that.
I think again,
Can you wait for the microphone?
Yeah, I think, again, we need to consider the level of cognition. So I think even the pharmacological interventions alter at the level of automatic thoughts. And I think that some of the work on prevention of relapse have to do with changing at a deeper level, either at dysfunctional attitudes or attributional style. So I think that may differentiate some of the different psychotherapeutic
in our
interventions.
meta-analysis, we found the same effect on dysfunctional attitude scale, for example, not only on the automatic thought, also at the more deep level. That is why we had the debate.
Okay. But there may be, then we haven't gone deep enough.
One of the things that's interesting that comes out of the literature on strengths and resilience is that when we start thinking about strengths and positive human development, if we think about dysfunction like depression, anxiety, disorders, there's usually, we can identify through the cognitive model, neuropsychological models, whatever, we can usually identify pathways and say, this is the pathway that leads you to become depressed. And sometimes there's more than one pathway, but they're pretty defined. One of the interesting thing about tapping into the literature on strengths and positive qualities is that there are nearly an infinite number of ways to function positively in the world. There are many, many pathways to positive growth and to positive learning. And I think this is another way of thinking about the different psychotherapies that have been shown to be effective. For one person, more classic cognitive interventions might be the very best pathway for them to find their way through depression. For another one, there might be a more behavioral pathway that works for that person because that may fit that person's learning style. There have been a few pilot studies done now that show that if you use a treatment that matches the person's preferred style of just self-management of depression, if they prefer being active and you use behavioral activation and they prefer trying to think in more balanced ways and you use cognitive therapy, that if you match their natural tendency, you actually get faster response in the opening weeks of therapy than if you try to teach them a model that doesn't match their natural style. So I think the good news in the development is I think the cognitive model is right now stands alone as the best researched and the most evidence supporting it. What we may be looking at is getting better in the future because not everybody gets better with the cognitive therapy if you're taking pure cognitive approaches. I was very intrigued, and I want everyone in this room who was interested in Paul Grant's presentation this morning about doing action in therapy and learning and tapping into people's interests and using that for positive change. All of those principles he was talking about do not just work with people with psychosis, they work with all of us. And so I think in the future, I hope to see a lot more flexibility in each of our practices where, with some people we may sit down and talk through some of their distortions and biases and all of that, but with other clients, we may say, let's go for a walk, let's talk about this, or let's go do something together, or bring in this thing you're working on, show me how it works. And different methods will work with different people, and we may be able to raise our treatment effectiveness above that threshold that we seem to have a hard time breaking.
I think looking at the person and individual level is really important, and I think we should also try to think of regrouping the sort of heterogeneity of human suffering that is different from the DSM, because the DSM is constraining us too much. So even though the term depression and schizophrenia and so forth is easy, but it really clouds the picture too much. And I think we need to figure out a system that actually matches onto processes and procedures that eventually tell the client, the clinician, not only a description of the client, but also gives concrete treatment implications, knowing what the person needs in terms of treatment. I think we're too detached from it, and it might be just also time to come up with our own diagnostic system.
Any other comments? You know what? I would like to try and get the microphone out.
Sounds good.
I don't know if does anyone out have any questions or comments away from the front row? Anyone? No? Okay. Well, in that case, Sarah, will you give the mic to? Yes. Okay.
I want to take us back to the economic argument, because I think that's the one that's going to be compelling. And in the British example, I believe it was a study of all of the costs of mental health, including disability, unemployment, criminal justice, substance abuse costs. It was that all non-balkanized system where all of the costs were swept together that showed, you know, the positive cost effectiveness of treatment. I don't know how we get to that in our country where we have a very balkanized system. I'd love to hear comments about this, but I think that's the royal road to getting CBT approved on some kind of more national guideline level.
A starting point might be the book called Thrive, which David Clark wrote with Lord Layard, and it outlines the economic argument that they used.
Just sort of an interesting anecdote. The way the British system got going was the Treasury Department started to complain about the cost, all the claims that were made, and there are numerous claims that are made, not only for the drugs, but for nursing care, rehabilitation, the visits, and so on. And it was the Treasury in Britain that provided the catalyst for the new change.
I think there was also the point when we heard Lord Laird and David Clark talking about data and the way data was collected, and creating a pretty compelling conversation around, a common conversation about the kind of data that we needed to collect to support the economic argument. Wow, that would take a lot of co-engineering across a broad range of systems, but we obviously we need to do that, right? Yeah, yes. Here, would you like? Right here, Sarah.
Just to comment on that, in the UK, they were actually, the economic argument was that we would only get 50% of the people in any way better. So it wasn't even saying, you have to be producing amazing stats. It was 50% the economic argument. And in terms of the data, as a clinician, it isn't that much, because you get tick boxes, and it's things like, are you unemployed? Are you working part-time? And then the work and social adjustments, and then just a couple of scales, and they do those every week, and then you just input those. So it's not a lot of information, but it's enough to kind of convince and show how we're doing in our services. So
do you remember the beginning of the day when I said something about be careful what you say to me, because we're going to try and figure out how to use that? It sounds like you would be a great person to help, that you just volunteered, as a matter of fact, to help us try and figure out how to do that.